Hey all, AK here. I've teamed up with Vespers and the Warp Academy crew to bring all of you some free new tutorials and free production tools. You can learn more about me on my website, aktunes.com, or check out my trainer profile back at Warp Academy. Don't forget to click this link and grab the free download so you can follow along with this tutorial. Alright, let's get to the good stuff. So you want to do some parallel processing in Live, where one chain is processing the highs and one chain is processing the lows. Maybe you want to nerify some respace or thicken up a lead or just create some interesting harmonic dynamics by splitting the signal into two groups. This is a very common technique in modern electronic music production, and all those big, thick, juicy sounds you hear from your favorite producers are, in some part, a result of really precise and properly implemented parallel processing. Let me show you the most common way of doing this, and that will help us understand the problem implicit in trying to achieve a perfect split. So here we have a little bass loop. Though you can use this technique to split the signal on any audio or MIDI track in Live. The most straightforward way to split a signal, say in two chains, one for the high frequencies and one for the lows, is to drop in an EQ. Draw an extreme low pass slope, somewhere between 80 and 300K, depending on where you want your division to be. Then put this effect in a rack, duplicate the EQ, and on the newly duplicated version, change your filter type to be a high pass filter, placed in the same position. Now the bottom rack has the highs coming through it, and the top rack has the lows. And as they come out of the group, they are being summed together, which results in almost the same signal as the original. But now you have the added bonus of being able to process the highs and lows independently. It's good practice to name the chains appropriately, and for an extra tip, you can map the frequency of the EQ point we're using in both racks to the same macro knob in the group, which essentially lets you move the crossover point that Live is using to split up each rack. I've seen people use autofilter or other types of filters to do this. It doesn't matter which tool you use. I happen to think an EQ is a bit more precise than an autofilter. And yet, the EQ often isn't as precise as I want it to be. And so I've developed a neat solution to use phase cancellation, rather than traditional EQing or filtering, to achieve the same high-low split, but without any overlapping frequencies. In short, the perfect high-low split. Let's first explore the problem of using EQs like we have here. Looking at our low-pass EQ, the Q value on the end here determines the shape of the filter. If we bring it up, we see a resonant bump, and if we move it down, we have a smoother, less dramatic curve. What I want to tell you is that it doesn't matter how specifically you tune the Q value, the slope of this curve is such that it will always allow a little bit of highs through the signal. This is its design. Because of its shape, it lets less and less highs through as we go up the frequency spectrum. And because this type of filter has slope in the first place, its apex does not act like a brick wall, but more like a slide, slope downwards. I should note that this is also true of the high-pass EQ, but in reverse. Where the EQ slopes down here, it lets less and less highs in. Now, if we weren't processing these things in parallel and summing them together, this really wouldn't be a problem. But because we are, the result is that we do not have a truly absolute crossover. What I mean by this is that even though the lows rack represents mostly the lows, it also contains a little bit of the highs. And even though the highs rack represents mostly the highs, it also contains a little bit of the lows. When we sum these two signals together and the sound comes out of our group, the problem is that where these frequencies overlap, we are sending them through both chains. So despite our best efforts to fine-tune these two EQs, because of how EQs work, we will never achieve a perfect split with no crossover frequencies. So, I have a rack which solves this problem, and I encourage you to download it and use it in your own workflow. However, I want to show you how it's built so you can build one your own and conceptually understand why phase cancellation can be your friend. So before I get into how this whole thing works, I first want to acknowledge that I first learned about this method of splitting up audio from a producer named Mr. Bill, whom, if you don't know, is an Ableton genius, an absolute ninja producer, and first pointed out this technique in a tutorial video that you can find on his channel. So I'll delete what we have here and start exactly as before. Drop in an EQ, and find your crossover point where you want it to split the highs and the lows. Implement a low pass filter here, then duplicate it, label the bottom one lows and the top one highs. So what you should have now is two identical EQs in two identical chains, which might be confusing, but now comes the cool part. On the highs chain, take your EQ that you just copied over and put that in a group. Now what we have is a rack inside a rack. On that nested rack, create another empty chain by right-clicking and then clicking Create Chain, and then drop a utility on this chain. Now I'm going to name the top chain in the nested rack lows again, and the bottom one invert phase. Next, go to that utility we just added and turn on both left and right phase inversion. And now we're done. You have a perfect high-low split. Let me explain. When the signal goes into the highs rack, we have just the lows coming through this chain within the nested rack. On the bottom chain, we have the complete mix coming through, though it's being perfectly inverted out of phase by our utility. I won't go into an in-depth explanation of phase cancellation, which is a fascinating subject that you can read about if you're interested. But the bottom line is that when you combine a sound with its perfect out-of-phase inverse, you get silence. They cancel each other out. Here, the two chains are not exactly identical. However, the lows in the top rack are perfectly out of phase with the lows in the bottom rack. When they are summed together by the nested rack, what we are left with is just the highs. In short, we're using phase cancellation to silence just the low end, and what we're left with, when it's all summed together, is just the high end, the perfect inverse of our lows from the top. So it solves our problem I explained earlier. It allows me to, for instance, compress the hell out of the low end of this bass without affecting anything above my cutoff frequency. For an added bonus, map the crossover point of both EQs to the same knob with the same range, and now you have the flexibility of a movable crossover point with the precision of a perfect high-low split. Of course, you don't need to understand the physics to use it. Once you've made this rack or downloaded my example, you can use the exact same implementation on any track and add one more notch to your mixing tool belt. If anyone figures out how to do this for parallel frequency splits of 3 or more zones, definitely let us know. We're all ears. So that's it for this video. If this was useful to you guys, do us the favor of liking this video so we can bring you more. Also, make sure you click this link to grab a free download of all the files we built in this tutorial. Warp Academy is a huge library of production courses and free tools, synth patches, samples, templates, custom racks. It's an amazing resource for you to level up your production skills and find your chops with legit quality stuff. So come join us back at the site and stay tuned for more freebies. See you next time.